What's each one of them? So the very first one, that if you take the best practice or the strategy, what a company will be implementing in DevOps is called as continuous development. So what do you mean by continuous development, and who should be adopting it? Now, it's not just developers, because usually we think, whenever I say development, immediately you will think of this, oh, it's bunch of programmers or developers where they will be writing a Java code or a .NET code or a C++ code, right? Now, when I say continuous development, we also have to understand not just the developers, but each and every one of us will be doing some kind of automation. And for doing some automation, there will be some kind of files that you have to develop, which might not be a program, but still it's going to be some text related file. Like if you're writing a script, a shell script or a Perl or a Python script or a Go language script, still it is a script where you have to take some file and write it. Now, you might be writing some configuration file, which could be a JSON file, or it could be a XML file or a YAML file. Now, that's also called as a code. So what happens now, all of us will be developing some kind of file. The only difference between us and developers is they are creating a program, but we are creating some file for some automation or for some configuration. So end of the day, what we need to do is we need to make sure all of us work together to deliver the product within a given timeline. Okay. So how do we achieve? Now, especially when we talk about the core developers, for a project, there will be many developers. There could be like 20, 30 developers or 100 developers. Now, how do you make sure that all of them work together and at the same time, we are able to complete whatever the actual code that we want to come up? The challenge is what you will have is one developer will be developing multiple files, or sometimes the same file is also needed by another developer to work. So how are they going to work at the same time and achieve their requirement? Now, that's when what we need to know is we need to implement a best practice called Agile. And in that, we will tell this is how you should work. Okay. So DevOps ensures, and it also says that we should follow agile methodology in order to implement continuous development. And what are you going to get in this? Here, we will be able to tell in the company when someone is developing a code, whether it is a program or whether it is a test case for QA or a configuration file or a script. Where are you going to store? How are you going to store? Who should modify? Who should not modify? So you are also going to put those kind of authorization and a proper workflow. By this, any one of us for a company, when we are trying to develop a code or a script or a text file which has configuration, we will be able to do it faster within a given time. So that's what continuous development will be talking about. Now, anytime when we say a strategy in DevOps or a best practice in DevOps, it is with the help of some tools you will be able to achieve. Okay. So in that way, when we say continuous development, there is some process that you have to adopt. But end of the day, you need to use some tools for that. Again, from company to company, this might vary, but usually the process what you're going to adopt in continuous development is agile methodology. But in order for us to write the code and store the code, there are a lot of version controlling tools. So one of the popular tool what we have is Git. But other than that, Git is more of a client side. So whenever we say Git, we also need a server side tool. So that's when you can think of using GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, whatever the tools that you want. Okay. So continuous development is achieved by using the process called Jira or Agile. And along with that, you will be using a bunch of other tools like GitLab, Git, Jira, and all together. So this is the very first practice where in a company, with the help of DevOps, they will be implemented. And what's the result of this? Any one of us who are doing a development, we will be able to do parallel development. And at the same time, we will be able to finish all our coding within a given time. And we know where to store, how to maintain. Okay. So that's the first thing. Now,
Hi, sir.
please wait for the questions at the end. Okay. Now, the next strategy or the best practice that we have in DevOps, which a company uses, is called as infrastructure as code. Okay. So what do you Yeah. So what is infrastructure as a code? Okay. So now, when you start working, whether it is your development or testing for production, you need machines, you need database, you need networking, and a lot of things, storage, policies. Now, all these things right now, if you see, you're going to create it on some kind of cloud. Now, for that, there might be a new infra that you want to create, or there might be a existing infra that you want to modify or customize. Okay, what is that? It could be depending on the requirement, like I need a new machine, or the same machine I want to modify. Now, along with that, you also need the ability to create your infra or modify the infra faster. That's what the problem that I was telling in the beginning, right? Whether it is AWS or Azure or GCP, whatever the cloud it is. How do you create faster? What if I say I want 10,000 machines now? How do you create it? You cannot just keep going to the AWS or GCP console and click on buttons 10,000 times, right? So that's where you need an ability to create those infrastructures automatically. Okay, and that also in a consistent state. Consistent means if I say I want 1,000 machines, all the 1,000 machines should be exactly the same. Okay, now this is where in DevOps we have a concept called as infrastructure as a code. So this is where what you're going to do, you're going to write some kind of code, or what we call it as a syntax. Okay, using that you're going to declaratively tell that what is that you need. For example, if you want 1,000 machines, I can typically write some 10 lines of syntax or a code, and I can run it. With the help of that, I will be able to get 1,000 machines. And since we're trying to write a code, you can completely reuse it. Okay. Now, this is where infrastructure as a code is a concept or is a best practice where on whatever the cloud you have, you want some infrastructure. In order to automate it, you write some kind of code or a syntax. With the help of that, you will be able to create new infra or modify existing infra. Okay, so that's the process which talks about. Now, every company definitely needs it because this is how they will be able to scale their infrastructure automatically whenever there is a need. Okay, but how do we achieve it? Now, that's where this is the concept. Now, anytime when I talk about the best practice in DevOps, there is a tool using which you will be achieving. Now, some of the popular tools that you have in the market is Terraform. But again, if you specifically go to AWS, you have CloudFormation. And if you come to any of the other Azure or GCP, you have a utility called Resource Manager. So this is how, using this tool, you will be able to tell what is your infrastructure that you need in terms of code, and it is completely reusable. So this is going to be the second best practice which every company is going to focus. So what is the output, or what is the solution that you're giving through this is how do you automate your infrastructure, and how can you scale your infrastructure and make sure it is always consistent. Okay, so this is the problem that you're going to solve by implementing this best practice, which is called as infra as code. The third one, which is called as configuration management. What is configuration management? Now, what happens? You create the infra, especially let's say I created 1,000 machines, but in that 1,000 machines, I have to run different applications. Or let's say developer is going to use few machines, QA is going to use few machines, production is few machines. Now, all of them will not be the same configuration, right? Like let's say all of us buy the same laptop. You will configure it with different softwares, different versions for your need. I might do it in a different way. So that's how in an organization, creating infra, creating server is one work. Infrastructure as a code will help you to automate it. But what happens after you create? You need the ability to configure them differently. And that also, you need to make sure it is a consistent. Okay, because now I want to configure 1 machines or 100 machines, or whenever I want, I should be able to configure it exactly the same way. And that's where you need the ability to automate it and reuse it. Now, that's when in DevOps, the next best practice what we have is called as configuration management. So what is the problem that you're going to solve here is, given a machine, how can you automatically configure? Once again, for this, you are going to write some kind of code, or what we call it as a syntax, in a file. And with the help of a couple of lines, you will be able to tell what is the configuration that you need to do on that machine. So that's how I can reuse the same code for multiple machines at any point of time. And I can make sure they are consistent. Consistent means anytime that I want, I can get the same configuration on the machine. Okay. Now, again, how do I achieve it? So once again, there are a bunch of tools that is available in the market. Okay. Now, some of the popular tools that is available to solve in implementing configuration management is Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or SaltStack. So you can use any one of them and achieve. So if a company is implementing configuration management in DevOps, what is that they're going to get as a solution? Automate the configuration of different machines. Okay, so now again, if you think, using continuous development, you get the ability in the company to write code properly and manage code properly. With the help of infrastructure as a code, you get the ability in the company to automatically create your infra or scale infra. And with the help of configuration management, you get the ability to configure the machines which has been created. Okay, so infrastructure as a code is for creating that machine, and configuration management is for configuring the existing machine whenever you want. Okay, so that's how this is another best practice which the companies will be using. Okay, so now you allowed the developers to do the work, continuous development, infrastructure as a code. You have the ability to create your infra automatically whenever you want. And using configuration management, you can configure all of them. So what's the next thing that you're going to automate? So which is where a practice called continuous integration comes into the picture. Now, why do we need this? Because when developers are writing their code, they will be writing it in such a fast way because they have to complete it and go with the next problem, and then they have to develop newer and newer things. Only then we will be able to deliver faster. But we also equally need the ability to find out whatever the code the developer is writing, does it have any kind of bugs? Okay, so we need to have that ability to find it as soon as possible. So that's the main requirement that we have. And also, we need to make sure that if there is a problem, how quickly that we can give a fix for that, and we should update this on the production environment. So for all these things, what we need to know is, if a developer is writing a code, and when he uses continuous development and stores the code in somewhere, how quickly are you going back and telling him that your code has a problem or not? So such a kind of process where we take all the developers code and we keep continuously integrating, and we continuously give a feedback whether your code is working or not, is what we call it as continuous integration. Okay, now eventually, once again, this is not something which is achievable by one tool. So there is a combination of various tools using which you will be able to implement this process. And some of the very popular tools that you have in the market is Jenkins. But other than that, you also have tools like Bamboo, Circle CI, TeamCity, or Travis. Okay. So now when a company implements this process or best practice called continuous integration, what is that they are going to get the solution or ability? So they are able to get the solution where they will be able to find bugs, help the developers to tell whether their code is good or not as soon as possible. Okay, so that's the whole point of it. Okay, fine. So now we saw continuous integration. But what's next best practice? Now that's where another popular strategy that in the market in DevOps is called as containerization. Because now What will continuous integration do is, it will help to tell whether the code is good code or not. But eventually, what you're going to do with the code, I need to test it at some place. Or let's take production. I want to run my application, but we are not going to run my application like a traditional way. Or in other words, we call it as deploying your application. So what is deploying? You take your application, which could be a jar, var, or a tar file, whatever. So you need to install it in some machine. You need to configure it so that it can connect to a database or it can connect to some other service. And then you are going to start your application, right? Now, think when a situation like you're working in Hotstar and there are thousands of machines on which you have to do, you cannot scale it. So that's where containerization is a concept where an application is given to you. How faster can you deploy? Deploy means install it, configure it, and run. So that's how, whether it is thousands or 10,000 machines or 10,000 applications you want to run, it should be just matter of a seconds where I can just do it automatically. Okay. And not just that, I should not also be worrying about whether my application should run on CentOS on Red Hat. So you should have an ability where whatever the machine I give you, you should be able to faster deployment of your application, which is nothing but configure it, install automatically, and run it. Okay. And this is where you will be able to manage your applications in production, not just in production, but also for your QA testing that you want to do. So containerization is a concept where you virtually create an environment in which you can deploy your application faster. So that's how, if you now visualize, whether it is your Amazon or Hotstar or Flipkart, they have thousands and thousands of copies of the application running. How is that they can just get that many applications faster deployed? Is because they are not running directly as a traditional method, but they are using containerization. Okay. Now, again, whenever we talk about containerization, so there are a bunch of tools using which you can implement this concept. Okay. Now, again, one of the popular tools that we have in the market for containerization is Docker. So many times people don't understand the difference between containerization and Docker. So containerization is the best practice, whereas Docker is a tool which helps to implement containerization. But other than containerization, we also have a lot of other tools like Containerd or Rocket, using which you can do this containerization or deploy your application inside containers. But eventually now, in order for you to do all those things, you might also have to create your own images. Okay. And that's where you will be using some other utilities like Dockerfile, in which you will be able to create your own image. But once again, when you create an image, you have to store it in some place. So the place where you store those images is what we call it as a registry. Now, depending on what type of service that you're using in cloud, your registry will also change for your private registry. So if you go with AWS, you can use a service called AWS ECR, which will be acting as your private registry for your images. If you go with GCP, then there's something called as Google Container Registry. The same way when you go to Azure, you can use Azure Container Registry. So that's where you need to understand, in containerization, creating image is one work, storing the images another work, and creating containers out of it is another work. But regardless of that, the concept called containerization is going to help a company in deploying the application faster. Okay. So that's how to deploy your application. How is that you're going to create an image? Is that what you're going to focus in containerization? Got it? Okay. Now, this is one I was telling you earlier. So using containerization, you will get the ability to deploy your application faster, but that is going to work only on a machine. But when you take a real time in production, you will be having multiple machines, or what we call it as a cluster of machines. Now, how is that you're going to manage all those machines? And regardless of whether you're using Docker or Containerd, how are you going to create multiple copies of your application, or in other way, multiple containers. Okay, and that's where you need to make sure on those machines you have the ability to scale your applications or deploy your application as container. Try to understand. Containerization is going to help you to create an image and store it. With the help of it, you can create container. But now I'm not talking about creating one containers. I'm talking about multiple copies of containers on multiple machines. And that's when you will be using a tool on top of your containerization tool. So that's where if you're using Docker or container, now there will be another tool on top of that, which will be running on multiple machines or a group of machines. So with the help of that, you will be able to scale the container creation or deployment creation, and you can make sure it is always running. And in case if any issue happens, you have the ability to monitor and replace. So that's how, let's take the same example of Hotstar. Okay, so when suddenly the last one over, okay, you will see that people will just make a phone call and tell to your friends, man, you're missing the match. You should definitely watch last over. So suddenly from 3,000 million users, it might go to even 5 million users. So only at that time, in a fraction of a second, how is that they are going to create multiple traffic controlling units, right? Or in other way, how is that I'm going to control another 2,000 million users? So first, I need that many machines. So that is what infrastructure as a code will help. Then I need to configure that machine. So that is where configuration management will come. Now, in all of them, I need to run multiple containers. For that, I have already created the image using containerization. But now I need to create thousands and thousands of containers, for which we will be using this concept called container or deployment orchestration. Because what is deployment for us now? Creating that container. Okay, and that's where in the market there are lots and lots of tools again for this, but the most popular ones what you have is Kubernetes. But other than that, we still have Swarm, OpenShift, or Rancher. So what's the problem that you're going to solve in the company by implementing deployment orchestration? Given a group of machine, you have the ability to create containers to do deployment of your application, so that it is easily scalable, it's easily replaceable if there is a problem, and you can also monitor them. Okay, so that's how using containerization you can create images. But how to deploy your actual application on multiple machines or a group of machines is what deployment orchestration or a tool like Kubernetes will be helping you. Okay, then comes the part called continuous delivery, or we also call it as CI/CD or GitOps. So now you can understand continuous integration is a method where whenever a developer writes a code, you immediately go back and tell him there is a problem. But we can also integrate it with our deployment. So in that way, when a developer writes a code, you take the code, you immediately test it, and you can also put it to production. So that's how companies like Facebook, Amazon, Flipkart, they keep product up to date. Because you just open the website now, after a day or so come back, there will be update happen. So how is that it is happening? Because development is happening continuously, testing is also happening continuously, and that product should also be deployed on production continuously. So that is how the product will be continuously delivered from development area to testing to production. Okay, so for that, what we have to do is combine all the process. That is, combine the CI process where you create a product or a deliverable, and combine your deployment into production, which is what is the orchestration that we talk. So that way, CI/CD is, in other words, a process where right from development, you have the ability to automatically put it to QA and immediately put it into production. So that's how every organization will be able to deliver the products faster. Now, there are different ways to do, but as of now, one of the popular method that what organizations are following in DevOps is called as a GitOps method. Okay, so GitOps is more of a secured approach in which you will be combining the CI/CD, and you can build the product anytime and test the product anytime and put the product into deployment for production, and you can access it anytime. Okay, so how are we going to achieve? Now, this is where continuous delivery is not about combining a tool like Jenkins with Docker and Kubernetes. That's just a deployment. But if you want to deploy it in such a way that it's more secure, then we need to implement it with help of another tool which will run on top of your Jenkins, Docker, and Kubernetes. Okay, and that's where for enabling this continuous delivery, there are lots and lots of tools in the market. Some of them popular ones are Helm charts, Argo CD, Flux CD, Spinnaker, or Harness. Okay, so now when a company implements continuous delivery, the solution what they are going to get is an ability where they can integrate the CI process with the deployment process in a secured way, so that when a developer checks in the code, it can automatically taken into testing, and from there, if everything is fine, you can put into production. And that's how you're going to get a continuous delivery of your application. So that's how companies can deliver their product in matter of weeks or days also. Okay. Now, you're talking more about application and other things, but DevOps also focuses about solving the problems on infrastructure, not just creating the infrastructure and configuring. Because the fourth point that I told you in the very beginning, why a company needs DevOps is they have to make sure there is a stable environment, right? And also they have highly available applications running. So what does that mean? So that's what is monitoring. So now you have your applications, you have your machines, whether it is QA machines or dev machines or production machines. You need to have an ability to monitor everything. So when I say monitoring, monitoring is not just machine. You might have to monitor a machine. You might have to monitor different types of application. You will have a bunch of machines like clusters. Now that could be a Kubernetes cluster, or it could be any of the other application clusters you have, right? And you also have different services like database service, front-end service, load balancer. You have to monitor everything in production. Okay. And not just that, you also have to monitor your application logs. Application running or not is one question, but whether application is really running fine, that I need is another thing, right? So that's where if I want to monitor my application, I have to do a different step of automation. But whether my application logs are coming fine, if I want to debug something went wrong, how do I debug? I need the logs of the application. So you need a place where you have stored everything and you will be able to recall that, which is what we call it as log monitoring. Okay. And when I say monitoring in DevOps, we are not going to just collect data from different places, but you also give the ability like a dashboard where anyone can go back and see the data, what they want. For example, if I want, I can go back and see last week, what was the status of all my machines or what was the application log. So that's where in continuous monitoring, the problem that what you're going to solve is the ability to monitor different things in your production or QA, and you also collect the data, and you also give the ability to visualize it or like a dashboard. So collecting is one part, storing is another part, and helping the users to see like a metrics. So which is what we call it as data visualization. Now, all these things are not possible using one tool. So once again, in the market, in order to do continuous monitoring implementation, there are different tools available. Some of the popular tools for monitoring alone is Prometheus, okay, or Datadog, New Relic, Sumo Logic. Now, these are the tools which will help you to read from different application and services, which is the first part. Okay. But if you want to now do the log management and monitor only the application logs, then in continuous monitoring, there are different set of tools, which is where specifically for log monitoring, you have tools like Elasticsearch, Fluentd, Splunk. Okay, now try to understand. Continuous monitoring means monitoring your applications, monitoring your logs, storing it, and visualizing. So that way, there is a bunch of tools or specific tools for monitoring. There is specific tools for log management. And finally, you also have specific tools for data visualization, wherein I want to see some graphs, I want to see some metrics, what we call it as a time series data. And for that, we have tools like Grafana or App Dynamics. So now when a company is implementing continuous monitoring in DevOps, they have to use all these tools to help them visualize. So this is how they will be knowing what is going wrong and how they can fix it immediately. Got it? So by implementing continuous monitoring, what is that a company will be able to achieve? They have the ability to monitor their applications, services, different clusters, and they also have the ability to monitor their logs, and they can also see the data how they want. Okay. And one of the latest thing which has been added is what we call it as DevSecOps. Now we are talking about so many tools, so many processes, but when a company is now using so many tools and processes, they also want to make sure that there is security at every level. Security is not only for the applications which customer is going to access. You have to start enabling the security at every layer. Okay, so that's where, as a company is implementing DevOps, they are going to introduce this new area or a strategy called DevSecOps, where security at every level. So that's the first where is code quality. So when a developer is writing a code, how do you make sure the quality of the code is good and it is secure? Okay. Second, as so when you try to take an example of a bank, okay, and you're trying to do a transaction, will you be happy that something happens to that transaction and someone is stealing your details? Okay, so you should be able to run your application safe. So that is where your application security is needed. And now, how are you running your application? You're going to run your applications using containers. Okay, till then I'm coming to. So when you're running your applications using Docker or Kubernetes, you need to make sure your containers are also secure. Because when you take a lot of open source images and try to put, you don't know how does the vulnerability. So that's the reason you need to make sure your containers are also scanned and it is secure. Okay. Then you have to implement security at every level, which is what DevSecOps talks about. So it's not just that you have a code, you implement some security using some tools like SonarQube or code quality in your build pipeline. But like I said, your container needs to be scanned. And at the same time, you're creating infrastructure. How secure is that infrastructure? So if you are using infrastructure as a code, you also have to implement security for your infrastructure as a code. That's what DevSecOps talks about. Okay. Then at various applications, various layers, whether you're using Jenkins, whether you're using Docker or Kubernetes or infrastructure as a code or configuration management, there are a lot of places you will be managing some kind of credentials, okay, sensitive data. So you need to know how you are managing your sensitive data at every level, which is what DevSecOps talks, okay? And this is where in DevSecOps, once again, it's not about using one tool for everything. There are different tools for different purpose. Okay. Now, especially if you're talking about code quality, there will be tools like SonarQube, Dependency Check, or Fortify, using which you can tell what is the quality of the product. Now, when you're talking about, again, your application security, okay? So there's a concept called as SAST or SAST and DAST, dynamic application testing. So with the help of that, you can tell whether your application is actually secure or not. So some of the tools for that is being used from OWASP. Okay, so using this, you will be able to tell whether your application is secure. Then I'm talking about your containers and IAC. Okay, so whether you write your code in Terraform, you have to scan and make sure your Terraform code is also secure, which is where tool like Checkao or Terrascan will be useful. Okay. And now when you talk about containers, whether you're using Docker or Kubernetes, now you need to make sure that is also secure. And that way you will be using a bunch of container scanning tools like Claire, with the help of which we can tell whether your images or containers are fine. And finally, if you are going to manage secrets, then once again, there are a lot of tools, but one of the popular tool in the market for that is HashiCorp Vault. So using this, you can store all your credentials, your sensitive data, and you will be able to secure each and every application and process. So this way, now when a company adopts to this concept called DevSecOps in DevOps, it's all about ensuring there is security at every level. Okay, so whether it is development, testing, deployment, or infrastructure, you're going to make sure all those layers are secure. So it's going to be, again, a bunch of tools using which you will be able to ensure that security. Okay. Okay, so that's the 9 best practices that I was talking. But unfortunately, what happens now is, it's like, let's say you want to be a chef. Okay, now a chef needs to know how to cook on different cuisines, like for example, in an Indian way. So you should know North Indian, South Indian. But as a chef, there's also some basic necessities, like you should know how to sharp your own knife. No one is going to teach you that. And the same way, you should also know how to clean your place, right? You can't say, I'm a chef, I will not do all those things. So the same way, now DevOps talks about those 9 best practices. What are this? Continuous development, infrastructure as a code, configuration management, containerization, deployment orchestration, your CI/CD, which is continuous delivery, then your DevSecOps and continuous monitoring. Okay, but where are you doing all these things? For this, you need a infra, which is where, as of now in the market, cloud comes into the picture, right? So now let's take any one of the cloud, whether it is AWS or Azure. They need someone to take care of the basic operations of the cloud. So that's where what market is doing, unfortunately. Earlier, we used to have a separate person or a separate team called as cloud team, and they used to manage all the administration of the cloud. But nowadays, what's happening? When you can automate so many things, so they are expecting anyone who is going to implement the concepts of DevOps should also be aware of the basic operations that you need in the cloud. So let's say whether I take AWS or Azure, you should know how to create a machine, how to manage the basic storage, how do you manage your networking, right? How do you do your basic disaster recovery for anything? So that's where being a DevOps engineer in a company is not about like, oh, I know how to work on Kubernetes, or I know how to work on Docker, or I know how to use Jenkins. But where are you going to run Jenkins? Where are you going to set up your Kubernetes? Where are you going to do your build and deployment? So that's a cloud, right? So that's when it's also necessary that you should be aware of doing this cloud operations. See, again, you don't have to be an administrator, okay? But you should be knowing, given any cloud infra, how is that you're going to do your basic operations. On top of that, your tools and services will run, okay? So these are the things. Now, when you go to an organization in DevOps, they want any one of us to be aware of all these things. Okay, so these are all the things that a company needs when we say DevOps, because by adopting to all these 9+1 best practice, they will be able to deliver the product faster. They'll be able to get a better quality, faster feedback, and scalability. Okay.